I think with adoption of new tools and new technologies, platforms, we're actually in this time where how we source, integrate, analyze, and present data is changing very quickly. And I actually think commercial ops is in a very unique position and has the opportunity to lead or be on the forefront of that change.
Welcome to another episode of the Space Life Sciences Podcast. I'm Marc Iskowitz, Editorial Director at Bagoo. The biotech market entered 2026 with a mixed picture of encouraging signs and lingering caution. As we approach the year's halfway point, that picture has become somewhat clearer. Whereas in the last few years, the pundits were asking, is biotech actually recovering? Now, the resurgence appears increasingly real. Still, that recovery has been somewhat uneven, with venture capital prioritizing mostly later-stage assets. My guest today, Jacob Lai, Vice President of Commercial at Star Therapeutics, says all of this speaks to the importance of commercial operations. Jacob, who's helped build commercial organizations at multiple biotechs and supported high-profile product launches, says that if biotech's new phase of recovery is defined less by abundant capital and more by disciplined capital allocation, then commercial operation should take on more prominence, not less. Another theme that came up in our conversation is that we're entering a period very much defined by advances in AI, new data platforms, and evolving commercial models. As my guest asserts, commercial ops is uniquely positioned to help organizations navigate that transformation and perhaps even lead it. What I discovered during our conversation is that Jacob is the embodiment of those two ideas. On the one hand, helping guide decision-making around enterprise transformation, and on the other, also executing with discipline as financing conditions ebb and flow. And that strikes me as a pretty prudent balance these days. So without further ado, here's Jacob. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the individuals featured and not those of their employer or any other company. Jacob, welcome to the Space Podcast.
Yeah, thank you. So great to be here, Mark.
Great to have you. When I look back at your more than 30-year career, Jacob, a couple of things pop out at me. One is launch and M&A specialist, and the other is builder of commercial organizations. I was just wondering, which of those two themes do you kind of identify more with as a commercial exec?
Yeah, probably the latter. I mean, I would say every launch is different, whether it's the disease area or, patient population, infrastructure that you have, what geographies, you name it. So every launch is unique, and I would not say I'm by any means a specialist there, but I do love building companies and organizations. So I've been very fortunate in my career to help now 5 startup companies and biotechs in different capacities, in different stages, kind of build out some of that commercial organization and infrastructure, just working with very talented people. It's been fun every single time, very extraordinarily rewarding, where you surround yourself with just brilliant people and all working towards that same goal, right? Trying to bring a product to patients who need it.
Sure. You started out in medical affairs and then made the jump to McKinsey and then big biotech, and now you're working for smaller biotech. So it's been quite a career arc. This is just kind of a fun career-related question as well. We often hear reporters in the sports world say, what was your welcome to the NFL moment or welcome to the NBA moment? What was your welcome to biopharma moment?
Yeah. So, I started out working in large pharma, both from the bench side, like in R&D and commercial. Those experiences are irreplaceable. I mean, they were amazing, training grounds to learn the ropes, build the skills in terms of what it takes to develop and launch products. And ultimately, you get a really good understanding of what great looks like. But that first jump into small biotech, I mean, especially in a startup mode, I mean, that I would say was that welcome to an NFL moment. Like all the analogies apply, drinking from a fire hose, you're building the plane as you fly, wearing multiple hats. I think my favorite one is you get great exposure, but it leaves you very exposed.
Yes.
No one really prepares you for that startup mentality. You just kind of have to jump in the deep end and, learn to swim very quickly. But what I fell in love with was that sort of fast-paced environment of both just everybody working towards a common goal, decision making is fast, being scrappy, and just overcoming this fear of failing. You just have to go for it. So yeah, it's been quite a ride, but that for sure I can remember very distinctly is that, welcome to the NFL moment.
Yeah, I like that. You get a lot of exposure, but you're really exposed. So it's well said. Just wanted to shift gears and talk about the biotech landscape a little bit. I'm not going to ask you to kind of characterize that because we've seen some interesting signals. Early 2026 kind of confirmed what we saw in late Q4 in terms of the biopharma deal making, M&A size and volume. But I wanted to ask you, how is this, we'll call it a resurgence, kind of impacting commercial operations?
Yeah, it's hard to say, right? If we think back to Q1 of 2025 and Q1 of this year, 2026, I think everybody's starting it with this cautious optimism, thinking things are getting better from, the last few years in biotech, right? But of course, we know the rest of 2025 sort of didn't really pan out to the sentiment. So we'll see how this year goes. But what I think it did do was the industry has really learned some lessons from the last couple of years in terms of being pickier with investment decisions, being much more capital efficient. So I don't think that's going to change necessarily in the future. I think that's a lesson learned, and folks are operating to that. So yeah, I think we'll keep going with sort of that in mind.
How are you finding that sort of cautious optimism kind of impacts you down to the level of commercialization planning, go to market strategy, or is it not necessarily having that big of an impact?
I think it doesn't change things all that much from outside of being just capital efficient, right? Being very careful of how you choose to deploy capital in different stages. In terms of commercialization, I think there are much larger shifts in the market, from other things like impact of MFN or most favored nations or the implementation of AI. I think that are probably going to drive larger changes, going forward. But yeah, I think everybody has learned to be much more capital efficient for sure, and how to deploy capital, in a very sort of staged and again efficient manner.
Drilling down a little bit into your experience with smaller biotechs, oftentimes they have to choose between whether they want to be acquired or whether they want to kind of go at their own and proceed to launch the product as a standalone company. Can you talk about how that tension between we'll call it the corporate strategy, impacts the commercial strategy? How do you manage that sort of push pull between staying more flexible on the corporate side and then needing to make the commercialization plan?
I guess that's an interesting question. I don't really see a tension between these two groups, as the objectives are really aligned, right? At the end of the day, we're all in this business to help patients, providing better treatments and improving their lives and outcomes. So in doing so, like the question is always how best to develop therapeutics and get products out to the patients who need them, right? So from a very high 30,000-foot view, how do you maximize the value of your products to the patients and the community? So my perspective is you have to build for success. So anything you do building towards commercialization, that's the way to go. And that also creates value, whether you launch it yourself, or you work with a partner or you have an acquirer. Either way, you've got to build for success, and that should result in value creation.
Right, right. So the North Star is just building for success, and sort of everything else kind of falls into place underneath that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about launch prep. In terms of launch windows, some people say T minus 24, 18, 16. How soon is soon enough to begin building the commercial infrastructure in your mind?
I think in general, the earlier the better. Even early stages of understanding, the disease area, your patient segmentation, who your competition is, payer mix, payer dynamics, channel strategy. all that kind of informs how you run your clinical studies. And even from an earlier research stage, this could also guide what candidates move forward, right? And is it worth pursuing in the clinic? So at least in my experience, a lot of it depends on disease area, timelines of your pivotal studies and things like that. But the earlier, the better. And I think the timelines are becoming earlier as well, as we're seeing, clinical trials run shorter with surrogate endpoints. And there are some moves in the regulatory environment where we get faster approvals. So I think, the commercial lens is quite valued at a much earlier stage than previously.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good observation that launch windows are getting earlier. We actually also substantiated that in some research we did late last year, or at least the trend is pointing toward earlier launch windows versus midsize and large pharma. In terms of go to market, we spoke about the biotech resurgence a little bit. What other changes on the landscape are perhaps having an impact on GTM that you see?
Yeah, it seems like these days you really can't talk about go to market without talking about either MFN, most favored nations, and AI, right? How that's going to impact just how we do everything from our personal to professional lives. Yeah, so I think with most favored nations policy, right, it was initially designed to create price equality across different countries, but it seems to have been playing out a bit differently. So we'll continue to watch that as it gets rolled out and how it impacts go to market, especially in different ex-US countries. But that is, I think, a shift that's happening.
Because with MFN, with America joining international reference pricing, that affects other countries' ability to price their medicines as well, or affects the pricing that they set for their medicines. And, multinational companies, it affects their launch sequencing, right?
That's right. Yeah. And it is still a bit unclear as to how this will all land.
Okay. And then what about with AI? I want to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So with AI, I consider myself an optimist. I know there are different views on this, but I do think we're in the early days of this transformation in terms of how we do everything. Again, from both our professional and personal lives, right? And I'm old enough to remember the internet transformation and how that changed how we do everything. Right? It took some time, but I think once there was mass adoption, kind of reached everywhere. We saw, email replacing, snail mail, right? We saw search engines replacing going to the library, online gaming, versus board games, all of that, right? It fundamentally changed how you do things. But the interesting thing is all those things still exist, right? Snail mail is still around, although maybe more packages these days. Libraries still exist, maybe more in digital format. And board games still exist, for those nice days where you get no power at home. So I think, things have changed, but, we just adapted for these things for slightly different uses. So I think we'll see where AI lands, but I do believe, it has the potential to process data at a speed and a level of depth that we've never seen before. We can automate a lot of these tasks, freeing up time and resources towards innovation and really value driving activities. Who knows? I mean, I think, we'll see.
Yes, we shall see. In terms of AI's impact on commercialization, it kind of remains to be seen, doesn't it? I think one of the things that I've been watching closely, as I'm sure you are, is exactly how that execution layer will, or what it will look like, in commercialization. I don't think it's really panned out yet. There's been some studies that have shown that a lot of Gen AI use cases have not translated into costs or efficiency or value, however that's measured. And so I think there's been a renewed push, it seems like, so far in 2026 to really embed it, more so into commercial operations. So it'd be interesting to see how that pans out.
Likewise.
Okay, let's switch gears again. I want to ask you about commercial analytics specifically. You've worked for late stage biotechs. One of the biggest issues first time launch companies face is that, as we said, they're building the infrastructure as they prepare for launch. In your experience, Jacob, what are some of the ways you see this challenge manifest, and where are the pitfalls?
Yeah, I think one pitfall is just underestimating the lead time it takes to build that infrastructure. For example, the data warehouse. You got to evaluate all the different sources of data, the capabilities to connect all the different data streams, right? Tokenization, et cetera, all of that. So ultimately, you don't want to get into a situation where you're still building this data infrastructure as sales are coming in, right? And now you don't really know what's going on, and you can't account for, you know, where your sales are going and to whom, and to be able to generate the insights to change course or change any tactics that need to happen. So I think planning early is crucial, and understanding just how long it takes to build some of these um, data warehouse or infrastructure type uh, activities. I mean, it could be AI will make that faster, but for now, it's still a pretty long lead time to get that in place for a launch.
Mm-hmm. Once the infrastructure is in place, where would you say is the biggest bottleneck in terms of like data and analytics? It's in our research we found that real world data and system integration kind of the lags in those areas in terms of getting that data in um, can undermine confidence in the data. Where are you seeing the biggest bottlenecks in data infrastructure?
Yeah, I think we're in a world where data is actually plentiful, right? There's so much data out there. Uh, and because of that, there are multiple sources of truth. So I think the bottleneck is about how do you find the data that's fit for purpose, that really drives your business, that provides the right insights to drive your business, and then the ability to collect, clean, analyze, and then create insights from that data. I think that's an area that could potentially get faster, but it's an area that takes a lot of expertise and the right people to really make that happen, and working with the right partners in terms of the data feeds, um, the expertise to be able to understand what's behind those data feeds so that you can really trust and believe what you're getting at the end of the day.
Yep, right. It's important to nip those trust issues in the bud. Otherwise, you wind up with a lot of expensive data and no trust in it. How does all of that impact your buying decisions in terms of which data sources you buy first in that run up to launch?
I mean, at the end of the day, I think it's very important to work across the teams to ensure, be aligned on what are the metrics, right? What are those KPIs that we're going to want to measure? And going from there, again, data is plentiful, but you want to be very targeted in terms of what data will help sort of feed and give you insight into those metrics in the most accurate and trustworthy way possible. So I think that's sort of the start. And then from there, it is obviously working with extremely talented partners, reputable data sources, and some of that just comes with experience and relationships. I don't think that ever goes away. And just going from there and starting to build those things, and as we get through it, course correct along the way. But that generally is how I see it.
Okay, great. Going back to the point about preparing for launch, just getting to launch can be an accomplishment for a lot of companies, and we see that somewhere around 70% of launches don't perform to forecast. What do you think is your top advice for smaller biotechs to win at launch, not just arrive at launch?
I think for over a decade now, there's been this McKinsey study, and I'm sure it's been updated over time, that talks about, for launches, the first 2 quarters of the launch, the first 6 months of a launch, really set the trajectory of the entire product um, life cycle, if you will. Um, so many times it's about if a company is ready, how ready they are to execute those first 2 quarters. I mean, it might be a year, but it's those initial stages, of launch. which suggests there's very little room to make any mistakes or course correct. So, getting those systems up and running again with a long enough lead time, and maybe even be able to test it prior to launch, I think is crucial, because once the product's on the market, there really is not room for error.
It's like Mike Tyson said, everybody has a plan until they get punched in the nose.
Exactly.
You never really know until you get on the market and you see what happens. And we see a sort of a trend toward relaunches, which suggests that a lot of times companies are getting thrown for a loop in terms of once they do reach market, certain things kind of can throw them off. So wanted to ask you for a case study, something that you've seen or experienced, in managing your commercial operations at any of your companies where perhaps, the commercial, medical, and marketing teams were not working in sync, and how you address that. Can you share an experience like that?
Yeah, I think, very common example is when multiple team members, as you mentioned, especially from the field, are calling on the same stakeholder, right? Same physician or doctor, um, and it takes a lot of coordination to do that in a cohesive manner. But often, a rep has to do a visit. A nurse might go do a luncheon. MSL might have a separate call on a different matter. Might have a account rep that handles reimbursement issues for certain patient situation. So from that physician's perspective, just think about the customer. Who do they talk to if they have a question? Um, and then multiply that by how many companies are calling on that same person, right? And how many teams are calling on that same person. So yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen cases where that is not well coordinated, and it just causes a lot of confusion with the physician, and ultimately, especially if the physician has other choices, um, that's probably not the best way to go about it.
Right, some companies have deliberately overlapped, right, in terms of how many reps will call on a physician, right?
Exactly, and especially if you then throw in like a joint venture or something where now you've got multiple companies calling the same physician for the same product. It just creates a lot of confusion. So yeah, I think that's the area where I can see some areas for improvement. But I think having a well integrated communication platform, single point of contact, really triaging questions in a to the right person in a timely manner, all those things just requires some infrastructure build, right? You do need to have the infrastructure to enable that cross-functional communication. It takes training, ensure everybody's on board, and how best to address different questions from um, the physician or the customer, and then ultimately just really good communication.
Okay, right. So assuming that overlap was a bug and not a feature, um, you measure that through obviously how you measure all your touch points amongst your different functional areas. What's the takeaway for others listening to this?
This goes back to the infrastructure build, right? Having a really good CRM program, a way for the different field teams to communicate with each other um, for different issues, especially related to any individual customer or group of customers, and having a well aligned operating structure with the team. The training, as I mentioned, and practice. I mean, this is one of those things where it probably does take a few iterations before it becomes perfect. So, having that time and space to, try this a few times, whether in a test environment or, in the field, I think really helps hone the team's skills in communicating with each other and with the end customer.
Just finishing up here, Jacob, would love to get your parting advice here. Do you have any final words for your ComOps colleagues working across the industry?
Yeah, I'd say keep learning, embrace change. I'm definitely still in that position of learning every day. I think with adoption of new tools and new technologies, platforms, we're actually in this time where how we source, integrate, analyze, and present data is changing very quickly. And I actually think commercial ops is in a very unique position and has the opportunity to lead or be on the forefront of that change. So you can lead the change, learn new skills, processes, and ultimately, I think it's this function that could potentially educate the entire organization on some of these new modalities. So,
Yeah, I love that. Commercial operations on the cutting edge of some of these modalities. That's a great point to end on. Jacob, it's been a fascinating discussion. Thanks so much for your time.
thank you so much.
You got it.